Welcome to the criminal imagination. The lie did not end, it dissolved, and in its place the mind blinked once, then began to whisper something it could survive. The first part was the wound. This now is the mirror it leaves behind, still fogged, still speaking. Let's continue where we left off. There is a silence that comes after forgetting, but then there is the sound of something turning back. Did you ever create a self you could live with? That's where we begin today. Not with facts, not with recovery, but with a fragile architecture of self. Something soft enough to survive in, something half true and half beautiful, built because the truth is unbearable. Part 1 was about forgetting. This part is about when the forgotten begins to breathe. For this part, I added the book I am thinking of ending things. There is a reason, because no other book I have read captures the quiet, devastating erosion of self quite like it. In part 1, I explored forgetting as survival, memory loss, denial, loops that preserve the illusion of continuity. But this book belongs to something darker, something after, where Christine writes to hold herself together and Laeddis builds an illusion to avoid collapse. I am thinking of ending things begins inside the collapse itself. It doesn't explain dissociation, it embodies it. That's why it had to be here. Because this isn't a book about a person who forgets. It's about a person who no longer knows who is remembering or speaking or even existing. Reading it was disorienting at first, like driving in a blizzard and realizing the road has vanished. The voice is so intimate and familiar that I didn't notice for a while that it was unraveling, that I was being asked to trust a narrator who doesn't exist in any stable form. A woman who might not be a woman, a date that may never have happened, a house that bends time, a janitor writing poetry inside a school hallway that goes on forever. Everything is charged with emotional detail, but nothing can be confirmed. That is the point. The lie is not external, it is structural. The entire book becomes a mind trying to speak to itself, trying to hold its own gaze and failing. I needed this book in part 2 because this part isn't just about forgetting. It is about what happens after, when the lie begins to speak back, when the voice in your head stops sounding like yours, when you can't tell if you are trying to remember or trying to disappear. The narrator of this book doesn't lie out of cruelty. He creates an entire universe just to avoid the pain of the truth. He gives himself a companion, a romance, a car ride, a night of conversation, because that's what he has never had. And somewhere beneath all the surreal horror, that feels profoundly human. It's bleak, yes, but it's also tender, desperate. It's not deception, it's grief. What I find most unsettling and most necessary is how I am thinking of ending things dissolves the boundary between narrative and psyche. It's not just a story told unreliably, it's a mind folding in on itself, using language as both lifeline and labyrinth. The style becomes the psychology, repetition, circular phrases, sentences that fracture. It's all part of the collapse. And I realized, reading it, that this is the final stage of the arc I began in episode 1 of this. When the mind no longer trusts memory, when narrative is the only shelter left, when even that begins to break. And that is why it is here, because this isn't just a story, it's what inside of forgetting feels like when the forgetting is permanent. And I want to speak very carefully here. This is not clinical, this is not diagnostic. This is the soft underlayer of what dissociation feels like, not in textbooks, but in language, in story, in the way we narrate ourselves to ourselves so we can function, breathe, be. Dissociation is not always chaos. Sometimes it is clarity. The clarity of building a self that can endure. The clarity of knowing that the real self, the full one, is too much. So we edit, we abridge, we soften a detail here, we silence an entire ear there, we lie. Not to deceive others, but to stay alive in our own head. And fiction understands this more intimately than psychology sometimes does. There's a particular kind of fiction that doesn't simply depict dissociation, it mimics it, it becomes it. These aren't stories about broken selves. These are stories told by broken selves. That difference matters. This episode is about what happens when the story starts to resist the lie. When the self you built turns around and looks at you and asks, who are you really? Because forgetting was kind of mercy. Now the forgotten is waking up. I once read that forgetting is not failure, it's protection. And at some point in our lives, we have all done it. Some people forget a name, a day, a moment. Others forget themselves. But forgetting is never clean. It doesn't erase, it fragments. And when you build a life inside those fragments, you don't always notice when the cracks begin to widen. That's what we are walking into now. This is the moment in the mirror when the shape is slightly off, when the eyes blink a moment too late, when you smile and the face in the reflection doesn't. This is what I am thinking of ending things is. The point where the fractured narrative no longer tries to hide its cracks, where the narration blurs, where the setting dissolves, where gender, time, memory, none of it holds, where the illusion begins to speak back. But we will get there. I'll take you there. First, I want us to pause and return to the idea of self narration as survival. This is not a new concept, but it becomes more urgent in states of trauma. When the world shatters, what remains is story, and sometimes the story is a lie crafted with elegance, tenderness, and terrible necessity. When Freud speaks of repression, he isn't simply talking about bottling things up. He is talking about a line that the mind draws, a boundary between what we can carry and what will destroy us. The unspoken, the unremembered, it lives behind that line. And the stories we build, they live in front of it. That's what these narrators are doing. Christine in Before I Go to Sleep begins every day anew. Her memory wiped, her identity reset, her journal becomes her lifeline. Laeddis in Shutter Island constructs a whole identity, a whole mission, a whole world just to soften the truth of what he has done. And Jake, in I Am Thinking of Ending Things, dissolves into a fractured voice so deeply embedded in denial that he can no longer separate the illusion from the self. We are pulling all these threads here because something happens when the lie becomes too worn, when the narration begins to skip, when the room doesn't stay the same size, when one reads his own handwriting and no longer recognizes it, when the voice in the head stops sounding like you. And fiction shows us this erosion step by step. It's not dramatic, it's quiet. It's a word left unfinished, a memory that doesn't quite add up, a character that slips between I and she in the same breath. We don't always notice it at first, but we feel it, the faint sense that something is off. And once you feel it, you can't unfeel it. You realize you have been walking down a hallway that loops back on itself. You realize the door doesn't lead anywhere new. You realize the narrator isn't taking you forward, they are circling, stalling, repeating, trying desperately to keep the story intact so the self doesn't vanish. We are talking about the time when forgotten turns around and looks back at you. That moment when the mirror glitches, when the narration stutters, when you ask, did I do this? Did I let this happen? And if you are still here, still listening, I know you understand this on some level because we have all done it, curated ourselves, edited a memory, told a softer version of the truth so we could keep functioning. We have all narrated a self we could bear to live with. And some of us have met the moment when that self breaks, the fracture, the echo, the moment the story starts to unravel. And the deeper question beneath it all, what happens to the self when the story starts to resist its own narration? Let's walk in and let's keep walking. The hallway stretches longer now. The lighting has changed, just slightly. The windows blink out. The silence is thicker, and the voice guiding us, it's starting to stutter. And this is where we enter I'm thinking of ending things. But I need to tell you something right now. This story is not a mystery. It's not a twist. It's not even a horror story, though it wears that costume very well. It's a confession, a fractal, a descent into the softest kind of collapse. And like any collapse worth narrating, it begins with a voice. There is only one question to resolve. I am thinking of ending things. That's how the book opens. A woman's voice, introspective, wry, poetic. She's on a car ride with her boyfriend, Jake. They have only been together a few weeks. She's thinking of breaking up with him. She tells us this over and over, gently, calmly, as if she's trying to convince herself it's a rational decision, not a spiral. But already something doesn't hold. The voice, her voice, knows too much and yet too little all at once. Meanders, it forgets, it reflects, it repeats. The narration is intensely intimate and yet slippery. She doesn't seem sure of where they are, or why, or what time it is, or what happened 10 minutes ago. The car ride stretches, the snow thickens, they reach the farmhouse. They visit Jake's parents, but the room changes shape. The mother ages mid conversation. The basement door creaks open without reason, and still the narrator keeps talking, still composed, still trying to stay within the frame of normalcy. But the voice is fraying. This isn't a woman who wants to break up with her boyfriend. This is a mind trying to stay awake. And slowly, so softly you almost miss it, the possibility creeps in. She is him. The narrator we have been following, the woman, we begin to understand that she is not separate. She is a construction, a voice within Jake, a version of him, projected, imagined, idealized, possibly gender shifted, possibly invented to help him narrate a life he never lived. Because the car, the date, the house, none of it is real. It's one long hallway and he walks it alone. We find ourselves slipping out of linear time, flashbacks blend with projections. The couple's conversations repeat themselves with variations. The dialogue loops, glitches, vanishes. Sentences start unfinished, names switch, events flicker out of sequence. We are no longer reading a novel, we are reading the breakdown of a self. What's extraordinary here is the tone. There is no melodrama, no grand reveals. The disintegration of identity is narrated with gentleness, as if even the book is trying not to frighten the voice that speaks it. Because that voice, however fractured, wants to be heard. This is where the novel does something terrifying and tender. It invites us not to solve the narrative, but to feel its ache. We realize we are not watching a story unfold, we are watching a mind unravel. And more than that, we are watching a mind orchestrate its own unraveling as performance, as penance, as farewell. The narrator, she, he, both, wants to be witnessed, not loved, not redeemed, just seen. There is a passage near the end where the narration becomes dreamlike and disjointed, and a janitor appears, silent, shuffling, peripheral. And then I understood he has been here all along. Jake, the janitor, the real man, alone in a school building, sweeping halls, mopping floors, remembering a life he never lived, a woman he never dated, a farmhouse that never hosted them, parents long gone, an accident, a fracture, a mind that couldn't hold the pain anymore. So it invented a voice. It created someone to speak for him, to bear the thoughts he couldn't, to think of ending things so he wouldn't have to say it. This isn't dissociation as amnesia. This is dissociation as multiplication, as echo, as splitting the voice again and again until it no longer sounds like yours. And somewhere in the fracture there is hope. If I can create a self that talks, maybe I don't disappear completely. If I tell the story, maybe I won't be forgotten. If I write her, maybe someone will read me. What happens when a lie becomes the only voice you have left? You give it a name, you give it a boyfriend, you give it a snowstorm and a real scarf and a sense of humor, and you let it drive you through the end. This is the pain of I am thinking of ending things. It's not horror in the traditional sense, it's horror in the intimate sense. You are inside a head that is disappearing, And it's talking to you, hoping you'll stay a little longer because no one else is listening. We find there is no plot to resolve, no arc to complete, only one long hallway. And Jake walks it alone. The narrator here is a fractured self, temporarily displaced, gender shifted, hopelessly articulate, and desperate for witness. They are not asking us to believe the story, they are asking us not to leave. Because the silence after a fractured voice stops speaking, that's the real horror. And the only thing more unbearable than loneliness is telling your last story and realizing nobody was actually listening. And so we have heard the voice. We have followed it through Christine's tremulous journal entries, watched it rehearse heroism in Laeddis, and finally we have wandered with it through Jake's dissolving corridors of memory and invention. Now we need to listen more carefully because voice, the shape, rhythm, pattern, and presence of it, isn't just a medium in these stories. It's the entire terrain, a map of fracture, a survival strategy, a lifeline. Christine writes to remember, Laeddis performs to forget. Jake? Jake erases the voice completely, even as it keeps talking. That's what dissociation does. It doesn't mute the mind, it fragments the self. And those fragments speak in different ways. Christine, in Before I Go to Sleep, holds on to a pen like it's oxygen. Every morning she wakes without a past, but she has a notebook. Her own hand in writing she doesn't remember, telling her who she is. The page becomes her anchor. Today I woke with no memory. This is nothing new. That's what I'd written in my journal. That's what I read. But it still shocks me. She doesn't trust her memory. She trusts the version of herself who wrote yesterday. Or tries to. It's not a perfect method. Some mornings the entries sound foreign. The voice that wrote them isn't always recognizable. Still, she tries. It's such a quiet kind of bravery to reread your own words and hope they still fit you. Laeddis in Shutter Island doesn't write, he constructs. A man, a badge, a mission, a partner, a wife who died, a case to solve, a whole world. He speaks with confidence, sharpness, purpose, and it's all script. The voice is theatrical, detailed, rehearsed, but it is brittle because every line spoken as Teddy Daniels is one line further away from Andrew Laeddis. Every performance is a form of dissociation, and in that performance he is trying to avoid the sound of his true voice, the one that might scream. Now Jake, in I Am Thinking of Ending Things, does something even more extreme. He doesn't just change the voice, he removes himself from it entirely. The narrator for most of the book isn't Jake, it's the girlfriend. A poetic, observational, sharp, self questioning voice that sounds like it knows itself. But she isn't real. She has never existed. She is the narration of a man who cannot speak as himself. So he invents someone who can. And the closer we get to the truth, the more that voice falls apart. Sentences fragment, time stutters, thoughts repeat. The narrator doesn't vanish in a blaze of revelation. She dissolves slowly into static. By the final chapters, we are not sure who is speaking. The lines blur, grammar breaks down, the text itself fractures. Page layout, spacing, formatting all begin to mirror the mental collapse. The mind that has built this whole narrative is failing to hold it together. This brings us to the aesthetic of dissociation. Because the style of these books isn't decorative, it's diagnostic. The stream of consciousness, the repetition, the disorientation, these are not quirks, they are symptoms. They are the textual equivalent of tremors in a patient's hand, the shake behind the sentence, the blur behind the metaphor. When Christine repeats facts, there is a man who says he's my husband. I write this because I must not forget to doubt him. She's not being redundant. She's trying to stitch a coherent narrative out of daily erasure. When Laeddis repeats memories out of sequence and his dreams blur into flashbacks and we hear things before he's ready to say them, that is the defense cracking. When Jake's narration slips from observation to implosion, when a thought becomes a hallway, becomes a phone call, becomes a childhood memory, becomes a freezer full of janitor's clothes, that's not confusion. That's structural dissociation rendered through form. There is a line from I'm thinking of ending things that echoes through all of this. It's spoken quietly, almost like a throwaway. It goes like this: there is something profoundly wrong, but I can't stop driving. And that, right there, is the aesthetic thesis of all the three books. The voice suspects something is wrong, but the voice is also the vehicle, so it keeps going. Even if the roads is looping, even if the signs are wrong, even if it is a dream, even if it ends in a dead end. Because to stop would mean confronting the truth. To stop would mean silence, and silence for a fractured voice is annihilation. So it repeats, it narrates, it creates new selves to carry the old wounds and find metaphors that are easier to live with than memories. It builds stories like scaffolding around trauma, and it lets us, the readers, walk through these stories like corridors until we realize there are no exits, only mirrors. This is why these books stay with you, stayed with me, not for their twists, for their textures, for their syntax, for the way they teach how a mind sounds when it's breaking in slow motion, and for the terrible aching beauty of a voice trying to hold on, whether it is scribbled in a notebook, rehearsed in a delusion, or spoken by a woman who never existed. It's still a voice, and it's still asking, do you hear me? We were following voices when they were still whole. Now we step inside their fragmentation. Dissociation as narrative is not ornamental. It's the pattern of a mind trying to steady itself when nothing feels solid anymore. Stream of consciousness, repetition, surreal shifts, they are not indulgences. They are tremors beneath the words. The car ride through the snow, the closed door that becomes a room that stretches, the mother who ages mid conversation, the banter that repeats, the phrases that echo, the voices telling us something is wrong, yet it drives on. There is something profoundly wrong, but I can't stop driving. That line hovers in the text like a pulse. It holds tension. It admits a fissure and yet presses forward. The narrator suspects fracture, but the narration must continue. Because the self depends on motion even when the ground beneath it is dissolving. In Christine's world, every morning she rebuilds herself with pen and paper. The narrative recurs because the self resets. Over and over, she returns to her diary. Each time she reads gives her a small shock. Each morning she must out, build a new version to live inside. That repetition is her to being. Laeddis in Shutter Island performs the repetition to self. He lives the same mission, follows the same clues, enters the same rooms, hears the same lies, the diagnostic tests, the ward rounds, the hidden hospital files. Every clue is placed to share up his delusion. His repetition is armor. His voice is a handwritten script he recites to keep Andrew from taking over. Jake's voice in I Am Thinking of Ending Things does something more radical. It fragments, it loops, it glides from clarity to void. One moment he narrates from memory, the next he is describing nothing. The house shifts, the parents shift, language fractures. He seems to speak in half formed thoughts. He disappears into silence while still talking. These three voices trace a spectrum from memory anchored repetition to performed identity to collapse into voice itself. Dissociation doesn't simply silence, it dismantles. The rhythm of speech becomes the battleground. Each shift, each drop, each add metaphor is a crack in the facade. Why do these narrators feel more real than many reliable voices? Because they mirror the way we all sometimes lose ourselves. Not in one moment, but in the wash of days. We forget ourselves in grief. We abandon parts of our memories in shame. We edit our stories to survive, and sometimes those edits begin to dominate. The part I couldn't live with becomes the part I wanted to erase, and sometimes the part that remains begins to do the erasing. Stream of consciousness is the language of a mind holding too many fragments. The narrative dissolves into thoughts, into white space, into rhythms that repeat because the mind is stunned. The repetition is not laziness, is insistence. An attempt to say, I'm still here, even if it is in pieces. These stories ask us to slow down, to listen to the space between clauses, to notice when the voice glides off the rail, to feel the ache in a line that repeats itself with variation. Good narrators hide the seams. These narrators expose them. Their aesthetic is their wound. What kind of bravery is this? To speak from a self dissolving under its own weight, to let the lie fracture, to allow language to crack open, to write fragments into sentences even as the self disperses. This is dissociation as protest, as survival, as art. The voice that cannot hold the whole remembers it in parts, speaks in fragments, listens to its own echoes. We are unsettled by these texts because they mirror how we lie to ourselves, how we repeat, how we edit, how we hide pieces, how we tell stories that keep us just alive enough, because sometimes the lie is the only strength left, and we admire them, though we know the lie. We admire the voice brave enough to keep speaking it, to let it unspool until the self begins to shift. So we walk forward into the unraveling willingly, into the voice that says everything and nothing, into corridors that are memory, illusion, collapse. Have you ever lied quietly, silently only to yourself, just to keep going? I have. I'm not proud of it, but I understand it now. Lies are sometimes the softest way we stretch the distance between despair and survival. You tell a smaller lie than the one that would fracture you. You change a small detail, omit a memory, rehearse a version of yourself that can somehow breathe through the day. I have done this many times in half remembered conversations, in peacekeeping with myself, in edges I didn't want to see but I still needed to live through. Forgetting is sometimes kinder than knowing. The mind relents. Trauma doesn't always scream. Sometimes it disappears into the background and one has to carry the silence. One has to carry the part of oneself that remembers whether you walked away or whether you pushed. You One tends to lose the narrative that said, I endured because I was there, and in place of that, I choose to live with the ghost of a memory. I believe that there is a self that is never fully erased, no matter how many lies we layer over it. Beneath every false memory, every edited sentence, every repeated reassurance, there is a trace, a tremor, a word left unsaid, a shadow behind the voice. That part of us carries the original name, the original wound. It waits so that if you ever stop narrating, it can say, I was here and I know. Have I lied to keep going? Yes, many times. To soothe myself, to soothe someone else's fear, to pretend I understood when I didn't, to skip details rather than open wounds. I have lied, and I am not proud of that, but I understand it. Because identity is a fragile thread. When the truth is sharp, we dull it. When reality is too wide, we narrow it. When the voice is too loud, we quiet it. Because we are trying to survive. So I ask you, whoever is listening, what do you carry unspoken? What lie have you told yourself to make the world softer, just long enough to breathe? What part of you whispers in dream waiting to be remembered? Because maybe that part is the only real self left. That part, that stubborn fragment that says, I was here, I remember something, I demand to exist beyond the lie. Open that door, face it, see it. Carry your stories close, delicate, fractured, even half true. Let them live in your voice and guard your silences closer. Because sometimes silence will be the only refuge until the fragment becomes whole enough to speak. Thank you for walking with me through the fractures. Thank you for staying with me with the echoes, for listening where voices begin to tremble. Until next time, keep your stories close, but your silences closer.